Let's move to this now. Greg Mills has written an opinion piece on the war in Ukraine as it's in its 8th month. He says the costs of the conflict are massive, but they are also hidden. The impact can be seen visibly in the destruction of infrastructure. To this can be added the cost to the global economy. For more on this, we are joined by Dr. Greg Mills, the director of Brenthurst Foundation. Mr. Mills, a pleasure to have you on the program this afternoon. Now, the war in Ukraine is in its 8th month, and the conflict has had a massive impact. Just how devastating has it called or been for ordinary citizens?
Well, it's been massively devastating for Ukrainians in particular, especially now that Russia has turned its attention to civilian infrastructure. So it's essentially knocked out at any given time about half to 60% of electricity infrastructure. So they live with perennial load shedding, but in this instance it's due to Russian destruction rather than simply due to neglect. And the other aspect, of course, is in the loss of economic potential, the cost to the Ukrainian economy, the cost to the global economy, which is estimated to be over $3,000 billion, $3 trillion. And then, of course, the cost in lives. Some 150,000 people, roughly 90,000 Russian soldiers included in that number have lost their lives. And it's very distressing that this was a war that was entirely avoidable and is really a war of choice, not dissimilar to the war in Iraq in that instance. But the costs, I think, are even deeper than the costs of in terms of the economy, in terms of human life. The costs run to our respect for systems of governance. And that's really what this conflict has become about now.
Now, you say that the costs can also be counted through the loss of human life, perhaps as many as 150,000 people having been killed so far since February. And not only has this conflict cost lives, it has also left many people displaced in that region. Talk us through this aspect.
Yeah, there are about 40-odd million Ukrainians, about 8 million of whom now live outside the country at any given time, and about 15 million of whom have been displaced by this conflict. And so as the Russians initially pushed in from the east and from the north, and of course earlier had taken over Crimea, many of those people moved further westwards towards and into Poland. And you saw in the first weeks of the war millions of Ukrainians on the march in the expectation that the government would collapse quickly, I believe. And when that didn't happen, many of them went back, but many have still remained behind. So there's a huge displacement effect, and that compounds all of the economic challenges. And this has led to many very split families, where you've got the men staying behind to fight and the women and children moving elsewhere, sometimes, as I've said, abroad. And the human and social costs of this, I think, have yet to be fully fathomed.
Now, there's also been the destruction of infrastructure of more than $120 billion at the last count. Speak to us more about this aspect.
Well, it's the stuff that you see on your televisions nightly, because this is, after all, a war in sort of real time. You've had the massive destruction of cities like Mariupol in the Azov Sea, for instance. That was early on in the war. And now you're seeing the deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure in the winter months. And I was there last week with Archbishop Thabo Makgoba, and it's -10 in many parts of Ukraine now. And you've seen the deliberate targeting thus of electricity and energy infrastructure by the Russians, in a sense to sort of freeze the Ukrainians out of the war. And this has enormous knock-on effects, not just the replacement infrastructural costs, but also the cost to human life again, to the effect on the economies, because many businesses can't operate without energy. And rather like South Africa, you hear as you walk around the streets of Kiev or Lviv, where we were, you hear the chattering continuously of generators as people make a plan. But as I said before, this is a plan due to war. This is not a plan due to neglect.
Let's expand a bit more about the ripple effect on the global economy, including the negative impact on 1 billion Africans by the rise both in fertilizer prices as well as fuel charges, and just the shortage of Ukrainian grains on which many vulnerable countries depend on.
Yeah, I mean, Ukraine, of course, we now know by implication of this war, is a massive supply of grains to many African countries, particularly those in North Africa and in Eastern Africa. And Ukraine especially supplies about 50% of world soya production, or it did at least in 2021. And much of that has been upended by this war, and that's driven up also fertilizer prices and fuel prices, and that's had a compounding effect additionally on the costs of foodstuffs. So this affects people mostly in the very vulnerable bracket. Those with a bit more money in their pockets can afford the increases, but those who are already on the breadline, and if you look at a place like Somalia, which is suffering endemic drought, this is hugely problematic for them, given the increase in food costs. And it's not just the increase in direct food costs, it's the increase in food costs via humanitarian agencies which have to buy the foodstuffs on the open market. So the ripple effects, as you term them, are enormous. And again, you're only going to see this probably play out over subsequent generations as we factor in the long-term loss of protein and the higher expense that many people have had to afford during this time. And then, of course, on top of all of this has been the downturn in the global economy, again exacerbated by high oil costs, high fertilizer costs, and the downturn in global markets. And certainly the war in Ukraine is part and parcel of that, because it's created an element of risk that didn't exist before the Russian invasion on the 24th of February.
Now, in your opinion piece, you also raised the sentiment that without Kiev's continued resistance, there are also fears that Ukraine's institutional and cultural character will be eliminated by Putin's Russia. Now, as Africans, we know probably better than most what it means to suffer under a yoke of a violent oppressor. There's also this view that the conflict is not a war between just two states, but between two systems, one authoritarian and the other democratic. Give us more of your observations in this regard.
No, I think every Ukrainian that you speak to doesn't speak about this war as being one between Ukraine and Russia. They speak about this as being a war of values, of freedoms, between democracy on the one hand and autocracy as represented by Russia on the other. And this is, whether you're meeting Vitaly Klitschko, the very famous former world heavyweight boxing champion and now mayor of Kiev, or you're meeting lowly officials or people in the street. They believe that they are fighting for their existence, but they also believe that they're fighting for the existence or in a sense, the supremacy of democracy over authoritarian governments, and they take heart from the fact that they're playing that role. I mean, I do believe that, given that this is largely a war of choice, this is something that Mr. Putin didn't have to do. He wasn't threatened in any shape or form by Ukraine. He was threatened by the existence of an independent Ukraine, but he wants to, in a sense, turn back the clock to where Ukraine was before its independence in 1991, to become a sort of supplicant, a colonial, a colony of the Russian Federation. And clearly, now that they've tasted freedom and they've had these various passages of independence, from the Orange Revolution in 2004 to the Euromaidan protests of 2014 and now this war, I don't think there's any going back for Ukrainians, and they certainly have been prepared up until now to take whatever the Russians have thrown at them and respond with equal vigor.
That was Dr. Greg Mills, the director of the Brenthurst Foundation, speaking to us about just the ripple effect of that war in Ukraine.